There's a strange feeling some people carry, not quite grief, not quite pride, the feeling of having grown up in a world that no longer exists, and then quietly adapted to a world that never quite felt like theirs either. You didn't have a name for it. You still might not. But if you were born somewhere between the late 70s and the mid-80s, there's a good chance you know exactly what that silence feels like, the silence of a generation that learned to navigate everything alone and never really talked about it. Not because they couldn't, but because there was no language for it yet. And there still isn't, not really. You grew up in a world where waiting was just part of life. You waited for letters. You waited for the weekend to call someone long distance. You waited to find out if the photo came out right. Waiting wasn't a problem to be solved. It was the texture of experience itself. And inside all that waiting, something was forming. Something unhurried. Something that didn't know it was being observed, because it wasn't. There was a particular kind of freedom in that invisibility. Not freedom from responsibility. Not freedom from pain. But freedom from the constant evaluation that would come later. The freedom to be contradictory. To try something and abandon it. To be one version of yourself on a Tuesday and a completely different one by Friday, and have no permanent record of either. That freedom had a shape, and most people who lived inside it didn't realize what it was until it was gone. Carl Rogers spent his life trying to understand what happens to a person when they're truly allowed to grow without interference, without judgment, without constant evaluation. He called it the actualizing tendency, this deep, organic drive in every living thing to move toward complexity, toward wholeness, toward itself. He believed it was always present. The question was always whether the conditions allowed it to emerge. For a very specific slice of people, those conditions existed in a very specific way, not because their childhoods were perfect, but because the world they grew into had a particular kind of openness that would soon disappear, forever. And most of them had no idea it was happening. If this is resonating with you, if something in you is already leaning forward, this channel exists for exactly this kind of conversation. Stay with it. You probably remember the exact moment the internet stopped being a curiosity and started being a presence. Not background noise yet, but no longer optional either. And you remember what came before it, clearly. Summer afternoons with no documentation. Friendships that existed entirely in memory. A version of yourself that only you and a handful of people ever witnessed. That version of you was never uploaded anywhere. It lived and changed and disappeared the way experience is supposed to. Without being archived. Without being made consistent. Without being held against you later. And here's what Rogers would say about that. What he understood that most developmental psychology missed. The self is not a fixed thing. It's a process. It's always in motion. It's always reorganizing itself in response to new experience, new relationships, new realities. But what happens to that process when the world starts recording everything? When every moment becomes a potential post, a potential identity statement, a potential version of you that others will hold and reference and return to? What happens to the natural fluidity of becoming? For most people alive today, that question has no before and after. Digital life arrived before their self-concept had fully formed. They've never known anything else. But for Xennials, for those who lived the transition consciously, who felt the shift in real time, during the years when identity is most raw and most alive, there's a different relationship to this question. They remember being a self before the self was documented, and that changes things in ways that are very difficult to name. There's a psychological concept Rogers returned to again and again: congruence. The alignment between who you are on the inside and how you live on the outside. Between your actual experience and the image of yourself you carry. When those two things match, there's a kind of internal peace, not happiness exactly, but groundedness. Presence. The sense that you are actually here, actually living your own life. When they don't match, when experience says one thing and the self-concept says another, that's when the quiet suffering begins. And most people don't even realize it's happening. They just feel vaguely off, like something is performing instead of living, like there's a gap between what they feel privately and what they present publicly. And the gap has been there so long it started to feel normal. Growing up into worlds, one analog, one digital, created a very particular kind of internal tension, not because the technology was bad or good, but because the two paradigms required different selves, different speeds, different relationships to time, attention, memory, privacy, presence. And Xennials were old enough to feel the difference, but young enough to adapt. That's the thing that never gets talked about. The cost of being plastic enough to survive the transition. Because adaptation isn't free. It takes something from the person doing the adapting. And very few people ever asked whether it was okay, whether the adaptation itself had been disorienting, whether something had been lost in the crossing. Most Xennials just kept moving. That was the ethos they were raised in. Keep moving, figure it out, don't make a scene about it. And there's a particular kind of loneliness in that. Not the loneliness of isolation, the loneliness of self-sufficiency that was never chosen, only inherited. You learned to handle things internally because that was what the environment required, not because anyone sat you down and said you're on your own, but because the structures just weren't there in the way they should have been. Parents navigating their own transitions, institutions beginning to shift, a cultural moment that had not yet developed the vocabulary for what children actually need emotionally. And so you built something internal instead, a kind of competence, a quiet, private resilience that most people around you couldn't quite see, because you never showed it. You just used it, and you got very good at it. Efficient, even. You learned to read rooms, to anticipate shifts, to hold yourself together in situations that deserved more support than you received. You made it look easy. But making things look easy is not the same as being okay. Rogers called this the locus of evaluation, the place from which you judge your own experience, your own worth, your own truth. In healthy development, that locus moves gradually inward. You stop needing constant external approval to know whether your experience is valid. You learn to trust what you actually feel. Xennials, in many ways, were forced to develop that internal locus early. Not because they were psychologically advanced, but because there was no one holding up a mirror, no algorithm confirming their existence, no comment section telling them who they were. They had to figure it out in the dark, and most of them did. But here's the tension nobody talks about. The same independence that made them resilient also made it very hard to ask for help later, to acknowledge need, to admit that underneath the adaptability, there was a version of themselves that never really got what it needed, and had never found the right moment to say so. Because when you learn young that the way to survive is to need less, you carry that lesson into adulthood as though it were wisdom. And sometimes it is, but sometimes it's just an old strategy that outlived its usefulness, still running in the background, still shaping how you show up in relationships, in work, in the way you respond when someone asks how you're really doing. Then 2008 happened. If you were a Xennial entering what should have been your most expansive adult years, you remember what that felt like, the floor dropping out, the sudden realization that the implicit contract, work hard, build stability, trust the system, wasn't honored, that the future you'd been moving toward had shifted beneath your feet without warning and without apology. Rogers wrote about the conditions necessary for psychological growth, what he called the facilitative environment: safety, genuineness, unconditional regard, not luxury, not perfection, but a basic sense that the world was not hostile to your becoming. For many Xennials, 2008 disrupted that sense at exactly the wrong moment, when you're still forming your adult identity, still answering the question of who you are in the world, what you're capable of, what you're worth, and the external reality suddenly becomes unstable. Something inside recalibrates, not always consciously, but it recalibrates, and the message, absorbed quietly, often without words, was, you cannot fully trust the ground beneath you, so stay light, stay adaptable, don't let yourself need too much. Do you feel that in yourself sometimes? That careful guardedness masquerading as flexibility? That ability to adjust that has quietly become an inability to land? That constant readiness for things to shift, not because you're anxious, but because experience taught you that they will? If something in you recognized that, that's the conversation worth sitting with. And if you found this space worth staying in, if this kind of reflection is rare in your life, consider subscribing. Leave a comment with what's been surfacing for you, not because engagement metrics matter here, but because the act of articulating something half felt, half understood, that itself is a form of growth. A like helps this reach the people who need exactly this, and they're out there, carrying the same quiet weight. Here is what Rogers kept returning to across decades of work with real human beings, in real psychological pain. The self is not who you perform. The self is not the story you've constructed about yourself for the benefit of others. The self is what's happening in your actual experience right now. In this moment, the thing beneath the adaptation, beneath the competence, beneath the carefully maintained flexibility. And for a generation that learned very early to adapt without complaint, to move without mourning what was left behind, to live in the crossing without naming it, that real self has often been waiting quietly, not lost. Waiting. There's another dimension to this that rarely surfaces in conversations about generational identity, the question of privacy, and what it does to the self when it's preserved. Growing up before the age of constant documentation meant that your interior life was genuinely yours, not because you were secretive, but because there were no mechanisms demanding its exposure. You could hold contradictions privately. You could be uncertain without broadcasting that uncertainty. You could change your mind without leaving a trail. Rogers placed enormous value on what he called the organismic self, the part of you that knows, beneath all the conditioning, what it actually needs and wants, not the performed self, not the strategic self, not the self shaped by other people's expectations, but the one that arises naturally when conditions are safe enough to allow it. And it's very hard for that self to breathe when everything is visible, when every version of yourself is cataloged and searchable, and potentially weaponized in a future argument or a future audit. The natural impulse is to manage, to curate, to produce a self that is defensible rather than one that is genuine. Xennials know the difference. Viscerally, they lived on both sides of that line, and that knowing, that embodied, experiential understanding of what it felt like to have an interior life that belonged entirely to you. That is not a small thing. That is a form of psychological literacy that most people developing their identities today have no access to, not because they're less capable, but because the conditions no longer permit it. Rogers believed that the fully functioning person lives with what he called openness to experience, a willingness to allow reality to be what it is, without filtering it through a defensive self-concept that needs to be protected. It sounds simple. It is profoundly difficult, because the moment you build a self that others can see, rate, and reference, the defensive self-concept becomes almost inevitable. You start experiencing life through the lens of how it will be perceived. You start making decisions not from your genuine center, but from the curated perimeter. And over time, that perimeter can start to feel like the whole of you. The curated version becomes the reference point. The defended self becomes the familiar one. And the organismic self, the quieter one, the one that responds before it calculates, begins to feel distant, almost naive. Xennials, who built their early selves before that mechanism existed at full force, may carry something quietly essential, not immunity to it, but memory of what it felt like before it. And that memory is a kind of compass. It points towards something that is still possible, even now. Rogers called it becoming a person, not completing a self, becoming one. The distinction matters enormously. Completion implies a destination, a fixed endpoint where you finally arrive and stop changing. Becoming implies something continuous, a direction of movement rather than a place to reach. And for a generation that has navigated so much change, that has lived in so many different versions of the world and adapted without ever being handed a map, perhaps the deepest gift is this: they know, in their bones, that the self can survive transformation, that you can be shaped by a world and still remain yourself, that you can carry the analog and the digital, the before and the after, the independence and the connection, all of it, at once, without it pulling you apart. That holding contradiction is not weakness. It may be the closest thing to psychological maturity that actually exists in a world that changes faster than any generation has ever had to absorb. There's something Rogers wrote that stays with you long after you first encounter it. The idea that the curious paradox is that when you accept yourself exactly as you are, then you can change, not through force, not through discipline, not through the performance of a better self, but through the quiet, honest acknowledgement of the self that is already here. And that acknowledgement is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't trend. It happens in small, almost invisible moments. When you notice a reaction you used to hide, when you feel a longing you once dismissed, when you allow yourself to admit that something mattered more than you pretended it did. For those who raised themselves, who learned resilience before they learned tenderness, who built competence before they built the courage to be seen fully, that acceptance may be the last unfamiliar frontier, not adapting to a new technology, not surviving a new economic collapse, not navigating another version of the world that wasn't built with them in mind, but simply sitting with the self that carried all of it, acknowledging what it cost, and then, without ceremony, without announcement, allowing it to put something down. You don't have to know what that thing is right now. You don't have to name it tonight. But somewhere underneath the adaptation, underneath the quiet, efficient, remarkably competent person you became, there is something that has been waiting to be acknowledged for a very long time. Not rescued, not fixed, just seen. And maybe what makes that so difficult is that being seen, even by yourself, requires dropping the perimeter. It requires trusting that the self beneath the performance will not collapse without its armor, that it might actually breathe easier without it. And maybe that's where it begins. Not with a solution, not with a strategy, not with a framework for becoming your best self, but with a moment of genuine recognition, of saying, quietly, to no version of yourself that was ever uploaded anywhere, I see what you carried, and I see that you're still here. That's not a small thing, that's everything. If this conversation reached something real in you, if something shifted, even slightly, share this with someone who might recognize themselves in it. Subscribe if you want to keep thinking together in this way, and leave a comment, not a polished thought, just a real one. What surfaced? What felt true? What has been waiting longer than you realized to be put into words? That conversation between people who are genuinely trying to understand themselves. In the quiet beneath all the noise, that's exactly where something real begins.